One of the latest issues in Formula One is the attitude that the governing body has towards drivers using foul language in certain situations. But while the FIA believed that it would be fixed easily after their request, it's actually been made a lot harder by the F1 drivers on the grid. Obviously, Verstappen has been in the centre of attention throughout this situation, but the three-time world champion has had the support of all F1 drivers as well as the president of the GPDA. So with this in mind, can the FIA actually force drivers into early retirement? And if so, will Ben Sulayem go down as the worst president of the governing body ever? It's safe to say that Ben Sulayem has managed to aggravate a soul or two in the Formula One world when he asked the drivers to use less swearing, comparing them to rappers. Just a couple of hours later, and Verstappen used the F word when describing the feeling of his car in Baku, which then aggravated the FIA's decision to penalise the three-time world champion by giving him community service at some time later this season. Neither Verstappen nor the FIA know what that penalty means, and that itself shows how bizarre the system is. There are penalties that the governing body issues, and then it takes time to understand what they actually mean and how they're going to be implemented. We already know that Verstappen is not too big of a fan of racing well into his 40s, but the latest move by the FIA might have pushed the retirement boundary a bit lower than what we would have originally anticipated. After protesting the FIA conferences by giving short answers containing one or two word responses, Verstappen said that he will answer questions outside, and one of those questions was regarding his early retirement and whether or not these moves by the FIA have any effect over it. To this, Verstappen said, "Oh, for sure. I mean, these kinds of things definitely decide my future as well. You can't be yourself, or you have to deal with these kinds of silly things. I think now I am at the stage of my career where you don't want to be dealing with this all the time. It's really tiring. Of course, it's great to have success and win races, but once you have accomplished all that, winning championships and races, you want to have a good time as well. Everyone is pushing to the limit. Everyone is in this battle, even at the back of the grid. But if you have to deal with all these kinds of silly things, for me, that is another way of not continuing in the sport." As I mentioned earlier in this video, it's not just Verstappen who's against the FIA and their policies. Drivers like Norris and Hamilton have gone on to publicly express their support for the Dutchman, and of course this has started an avalanche of responses from other prominent people on the grid. Alex Wurz, who's the president of the GPDA, has compared Verstappen's case to Steiner, who used the F word to make a popular face out of himself, with the Netflix cameras following him around and trying to extract as many explicit answers as possible. But when it comes to a driver who is getting through a lot of emotions by processing the nature of the car, then the FIA is paradoxically drawing the red line. Elaborating on this case, Alex Wurz admitted that the drivers will have an internal meeting, and in this meeting they will set some precedents before they go out to the FIA and say that enough is enough, because the last thing they want to see is drivers retiring or withdrawing from the sport because some policies that make zero to no sense are being applied. When talking about this entire infamous case of Verstappen and the FIA, Wurz said, "How many lifetime community services would Steiner have to serve for using the F word? He was glorified for using it. Netflix broadcast this worldwide, no problem. But then to suddenly change like that, I have to say the choice of words is not my personal taste as a driver. As GPDA chairman, I have to officially say that we will, of course, discuss it internally. First, reach a full consensus, and then we will consider whether and in what form we will talk to the FIA and the president." Furthermore, Wurz has pushed towards a scenario in which this issue would be solved internally without involving other factors, which is quite a positive thing to extract from the entire situation, because the less drama there is revolving around non-important factors, the more attractiveness the sport will gather around it. As he elaborated to a greater extent, "Personally, I always believe, and we also do this at the GPDA, we solve it internally. We don't go through the media. Very rarely does something go from the GPDA to the media, because we simply try to solve things internally for the sake of the sport and want to bring the people and the individual key stakeholders on our journey together. I think drivers have to be allowed to express themselves authentically to some extent." This makes a lot of sense because when you think about all the pressure that the F1 drivers are going through throughout the course of the race, it's very easily understandable how a small situation can make you frustrated to the extent of you cursing at someone or something. And what is also very important to note is that unlike in other sports, here the athletes have microphones on them all of the time. If that were to happen in football or basketball, rest assured that narrative would change a lot. As for Ben Sulayem, the argument that there are children watching the sport makes very little sense because, as Wirt said, the Netflix documentary Drive to Survive is full of swearing words, and Gunther Steiner has made a public name out of himself thanks to that infamous F word. Verstappen believes that the children who are watching this sport will eventually swear later on in their life anyway, even if they are not with their parents, and the fact that they are watching a highly anticipated sport is something that their mothers and fathers should know before they're putting them in front of the TV. Furthermore, Verstappen elaborated, everyone swears, some people a bit more than others. Of course, abuse is something else, but I think a lot of things get broadcast nowadays where in other sports you don't run around with a mic attached to you. A lot of people say a lot of bad things when they are full of adrenaline in other sports. It just doesn't get picked up, where here, probably also for entertainment purposes, things get sent out. It's just probably a bit of the world that we live in. I think it already just starts with not broadcasting it or not giving the option for people to hear it. Excuse me for the language, but like, what are we? 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds? Even if a 5-year-old or 6-year-old is watching, I mean, they will eventually swear anyway. Even if the parents won't or they will not allow it, when they grow up, they will walk around with their friends and they will be swearing. Be that as it may, the general conclusion is that the FIA doesn't make it any easier on the drivers because they are now forced to use language that would be more fine-tuned, and when they are going through a chicane or a corner at 300 kilometers per hour and their car snaps a little bit, which might be enough to throw them off pole position down to P5 or P6, I guess any living human being would also swear in their position. The controversial statements of the FIA have been present in the past as well, as we must remind you about the infamous jewellery case with Lewis Hamilton, with the 7-time world champion bringing every piece of jewellery he could during the Monaco GP in 2023. This statement was made just to mess around with the governing body, but even Hamilton stated that the president of the FIA, Ben Sulayem, never ever had his trust after another controversial case was made public. The investigation towards Susie Wolff, who was charged with conflict of interest as it was believed that Toto Wolff shared confidential information with his wife from the F1 team principal meetings. Other external factors also possess the opportunity to bring drivers closer to retirement, such as F1 increasing the number of races in a season. Sergio Perez has stated that he has no wish in driving on 24 races in a year, given the fact that he has a family at home. And Alonso also stated that while being in his 40s, the calendar is not something that's making him very happy right now, that the F1 caravan is ready to visit more street circuits for the sake of the popularity. What is good news from the drivers is that the street circuit in Madrid, which should debut from 2026 onwards, is now struggling to receive funding from sponsors, which wasn't a predicted scenario given the increased interest in the sport. So with all this in mind, do you think that the FIA's and F1's decisions have a massive influence when it comes to drivers thinking about an early retirement? Let us know what you think down in the comments below.